For decades, the world of ballet had three undisputed heavyweights: France, Russia, and the United States. Then, in 1988, Belgium kicked the door open, not with pirouettes, but with spinning kicks. The man responsible wasn't a legendary dancer. It was Jean-Claude Camille François van Varenberg, better known as Jean-Claude Van Damme, the muscles from Brussels. This is the story of how a broke Belgian martial artist fought his way to the top of Hollywood, became one of the biggest action stars of the early 90s, and then spent the next decade watching that career slowly fall apart. Unlike many Hollywood stars, Van Damme didn't have powerful connections or an easy path into the business. When he moved to America in the early 80s, he arrived with little more than a dream and an incredible ability to kick people in the head. At first, Hollywood couldn't have cared less. He survived by taking whatever jobs he could find, including delivering pizza. Between shifts, he showed up to every audition he could get. One of those auditions landed him a tiny role in Monaco Forever. The 48-minute film was ripped apart by both critics and audiences, and before his career had even begun, it already looked like it might be over. In 1984, Chuck Norris brought him onto Missing in Action. You won't actually spot Van Damme in the finished movie, even though he worked as a stunt performer somewhere in the background. His more important job was serving as Chuck Norris's personal punching bag. As strange as that sounds, it turned out to be a pretty smart career move. Then came one of the weirdest stories in action movie history: Predator. Depending on who you ask, Van Damme either signed the contract without realizing his face would never appear on screen, got himself fired by throwing real kicks at people, or simply looked too small standing next to Arnold Schwarzenegger. The truth is probably somewhere in the middle. Originally, the Predator looked less like the terrifying alien we know today, and more like an extraterrestrial giraffe. Inside that awkward-looking suit, Van Damme's height wasn't much of a problem, but once the creature was completely redesigned, Little Belgian suddenly became unnecessary. His big Hollywood breakthrough finally arrived in 1986, with No Retreat, No Surrender, where Van Damme played, you guessed it, a Russian fighter. Because it was the 80s, and if Hollywood needed a villain, making him Russian was usually the easiest solution. Van Damme desperately needed people to remember him, so he made sure they did. The script was still being written during production, which meant everyone was improvising. Jean-Claude took that concept a little too seriously. He was earning just $250 a day and apparently decided the production deserved about $1,000 worth of punches. If the script called for 1 punch, he'd throw 4. If it called for 2, he'd give you 10. The actors who suffered the most were Timothy Baker and Peter Cunningham. Cunningham was knocked unconscious twice in a single day of filming and had to be carried out of the ring both times. Baker was supposed to take 1 punch, but ended up eating a couple dozen instead. Years later, Baker even testified in court during a lawsuit involving Van Damme, claiming the Belgian completely ignored the director's screams to stop and just kept hitting people anyway. Off camera, things weren't much better financially. Van Damme was barely paying his bills. After filming each day, he often had to ask the rest of the cast to help push his old car because it wouldn't start by itself. No Retreat, No Surrender wasn't a huge hit, but it made back its modest budget. More importantly, it opened the door to the movie that would change Van Damme's life: Bloodsport. Thanks to Chuck Norris's introduction, Van Damme kept showing up at Cannon Films, trying to convince one producer after another to give him a real chance. Eventually, Cannon handed him a screenplay nobody wanted. Bloodsport had been sitting on a shelf for years. Despite costing only $1.5 million, the production was a complete mess. After filming wrapped in 1986, disastrous test screenings convinced Cannon to shelve the movie indefinitely. Ironically, that delay led Van Damme to another project, Black Eagle. Once again, he played the bad Russian. Since Bloodsport still had no release date and nobody expected it to go anywhere, Van Damme signed a 2-picture deal with Imperial Entertainment. At that point, he could easily have spent the rest of his career playing forgettable supporting villains. Even though he still wasn't a star, the Black Eagle script was rewritten to give his character more to do. And naturally, Jean-Claude immediately went back to beating up his co-stars. This time, even Sho Kosugi wasn't safe. According to people who were there, Kosugi tolerated Van Damme's very real punches to the face for a while, before finally deciding he'd had enough and started hitting him back. The two actors had to be pulled apart, and afterward Van Damme refused to let his character die at Kosugi's hands. So the ending was rewritten. Instead of losing to the hero, Van Damme's villain was fed into a boat propeller. After finishing Black Eagle, Jean-Claude realized that propeller might also chop up his entire career. That's when Francois decided to save himself. He became an editor, or at least he tried. Convinced that Bloodsport was his one shot at stardom, Van Damme begged Cannon to let him recut the entire movie himself. The studio finally handed over the footage, and to everyone's surprise, he delivered a version that actually worked. In 1988, 2 full years after filming had wrapped, Bloodsport finally reached theaters. Black Eagle, meanwhile, never got a theatrical release, which was probably the best thing that could have happened to Van Damme's reputation. As for Bloodsport, it became exactly the movie Jean-Claude believed it could be. Made for just $1.5 million, it earned around $12 million domestically and another $18 million overseas. Almost overnight, the broke Belgian pizza delivery driver became one of the hottest new action stars in Hollywood. And for the next few years, it seemed like he couldn't miss. But just when it looked like Van Damme couldn't miss, Cyborg nearly derailed everything. The movie itself was basically a Frankenstein creation. Director Albert Pyun stitched it together from the remains of 2 dead Cannon Films projects. One was a planned sequel to the box office flop Masters of the Universe, starring Dolph Lundgren. The other was an abandoned Spider-Man movie based on the Marvel Comics. Cannon had already burned through more than $1.5 million developing those films, so instead of throwing everything away, the studio recycled almost all of it. The sets, the costumes, the props, pretty much everything. Cyborg itself reportedly cost only about $500,000 to shoot. By that point, Cannon Films wasn't really running a studio anymore. It was trying to outrun bankruptcy with roundhouse kicks. The movie was filmed as quickly and as cheaply as possible, wherever they could find a location. Several actors even ended up playing multiple characters. The results were less than encouraging. Test screenings were a complete disaster. Only 1 out of 100 viewers reportedly gave the movie a positive rating. Normally, that's the kind of result that gets a movie locked in a vault forever, but Cannon didn't have the luxury of pretending expensive mistakes never happened. The plan was simple: dump Cyborg into theaters, recover whatever cash they could, and move on. Then Francois stepped in again. Just like he had with Bloodsport, Van Damme convinced the studio to let him recut the movie himself. Around the same time, another chapter from his accidentally hurting co-stars collection reached the courtroom. During filming, Van Damme accidentally hit actor Jackson Pinckney in the eye with a ball. Pinckney sued him, and Jean-Claude eventually paid an undisclosed settlement. Despite all the chaos, Cyborg performed reasonably well. It couldn't match Bloodsport, but on a reported $2 million budget, it earned around $10 million in the US plus additional money overseas. Then came Kickboxer. And suddenly, Van Damme wasn't just a rising star anymore. He was officially one of the biggest action heroes on the planet. Made for only $1.5 million, Kickboxer earned more than $40 million worldwide, with roughly $15 million coming from American theaters alone. His next stop was also his last movie for Cannon Films, Death Warrant. Ironically, it became one of the least remembered films from Van Damme's golden years. That's probably because by then, Cannon Films was dying faster than one of its own movie villains. Jean-Claude owed Cannon everything. Without Bloodsport, there probably wouldn't have been a Hollywood career to talk about. But while Van Damme's star kept getting brighter, Cannon's was burning out. Not because of him. His movies made money. The real damage came from the studio's bigger bets, including expensive projects like Sylvester Stallone's Over the Top, which failed to deliver the massive profits Cannon desperately needed. This was also the moment another famous action star rivalry was born. Most people think Van Damme and Steven Seagal became enemies because they spent years taking shots at each other in interviews. And yes, Van Damme once joked that Seagal's dramatic physical expansion looked less like weight gain and more like someone trying to disguise himself from the mob. But according to Van Damme himself, the feud actually started much earlier. He claimed he stole Death Warrant from right under Seagal's nose. Honestly, that's a very 90s action star reason to hate somebody. By the time Death Warrant finished filming, Cannon officially collapsed. Van Damme didn't stick around to watch the funeral. He packed up and moved on to his next movie, Lionheart. Meanwhile, Cannon's assets slowly began making their way to MGM. Corporate takeovers aren't exactly fast, so Death Warrant ended up sitting on a shelf for more than a year. Ironically, Lionheart only existed because Van Damme still owed Imperial Entertainment one more movie under his contract. Instead of simply showing up, he decided to get creatively involved. Jean-Claude helped develop the story and contributed several of the film's stranger ideas. A fighter wearing a Scottish kilt. A villain with a white cat straight out of a James Bond movie. A fight that ends after a single punch. And yes, that scene with Van Damme's bare backside. That one was his idea too. Lionheart became the biggest commercial success of Van Damme's career up to that point. It earned $24 million domestically and was made on his biggest budget yet, $6 million. Complete worldwide numbers aren't available today, but attendance records in countries like France and Germany reached new highs for a Van Damme. While Lionheart was still making money, MGM finally took control of Death Warrant. The studio wasn't especially interested in the film. It had simply inherited it as part of the Cannon library. That's why many versions of Death Warrant still open with the Cannon Films logo, even though the company was already dead. The American release replaced it with MGM's logo instead. The funny part is that none of this really mattered. Even after spending 2 years on a shelf, receiving almost no advertising, and being largely forgotten, Death Warrant still made around $16 million in American theaters on a $4 million budget. By then, Van Damme could seemingly sell tickets just by showing up. Then he did something he'd wanted to do for years. He played twins. Double Impact wasn't just another action movie to Jean-Claude. It was his chance to prove he could actually act. Because nothing says range quite like playing two brothers who both happen to look exactly like Jean-Claude Van Damme. Not everyone shared his enthusiasm. Albert Pyun later recalled that years earlier, Van Damme had pitched him a movie called The Corsican Brothers, another story about twin brothers. Pyun says he told Jean-Claude the idea was ridiculous, advised him not to make the movie, and suggested he quit drinking while he was at it. According to Pyun, that conversation also marked the last time the two men ever spoke. Fortunately for Van Damme, he ignored that advice. Double Impact earned about $30 million in the US and became another box office success. By the early 90s, Jean-Claude Van Damme had officially reached superstar status. Every movie made more money than the last. His salary kept climbing, his ego climbed with it. Unfortunately, so did his cocaine habit. As long as the movies kept making money, Hollywood didn't seem particularly interested in asking too many questions. The first serious warning sign arrived with Nowhere to Run. Ironically, the movie wasn't even written for Van Damme. Originally, it was supposed to be a completely different kind of film. The screenplay was written by Joe Eszterhas and Richard Marquand, the director of Return of the Jedi. Marquand planned to direct it himself in the late 80s, but he died in 1987. His version contained almost no action, almost no fights. It was basically a romantic drama about an escaped convict who falls in love with a widow raising 2 children. Mel Gibson was originally attached to star. After Marquand's death, the script sat untouched until screenwriter Leslie Bohem reworked it into a Van Damme action movie. Joe Eszterhas hated the result so much that he publicly removed his name from it, saying almost nothing from his original screenplay survived. Van Damme wasn't exactly thrilled either. He later admitted he didn't like the story very much, but the writer personally promised to rewrite the script before filming began. Jean-Claude believed him. When production started, he discovered absolutely nothing had changed. By the time Nowhere to Run hit theaters, Van Damme was at the top of his game. It was his second most expensive movie after Universal Soldier, and it came with the biggest paycheck of his career so far, $2.5 million. Unfortunately, the movie itself took a step backward. American audiences weren't nearly as enthusiastic as they had been about his previous films. Luckily for Francois, overseas audiences showed up in much bigger numbers and helped the movie crawl its way to profitability. Then came 1994, the absolute peak of Van Damme's box office career. Timecop finally smashed through the 100 million mark worldwide, proving that Jean-Claude wasn't just another VHS action hero anymore. He was a legitimate box office star, and things looked like they were only getting bigger. The next stop was Street Fighter, an expensive studio production based on one of the biggest video game franchises on the planet. On paper, it looked like the movie that would take Van Damme to another level. Instead, it became the beginning of the end. I've already covered the behind-the-scenes disaster that was Street Fighter, so I won't repeat the whole story here. From that point on, the momentum was gone. His next movie was called Sudden Death. Unfortunately, that title turned out to be a pretty good prediction for his career. It was also the last time Van Damme received a truly massive Hollywood paycheck. Universal paid him $5 million to star in the film. The production itself had already been through Hollywood's version of musical chairs. First, the script went to Arnold Schwarzenegger, who passed because he was busy with True Lies and Jr. Then it landed on Sylvester Stallone's desk. Stallone reportedly thought the screenplay wasn't ready and turned it down. Next came Bruce Willis. He was too busy preparing for Die Hard with a Vengeance. Only after all three action superstars said no did the studio call Van Damme. He said yes. The budget immediately shrank by nearly half. Then the screenplay was almost completely rewritten. Ironically, original writer Randy Feldman later claimed his version had actually been a parody of action movies. According to him, almost nothing survived except one wonderfully ridiculous scene: the fight with the hockey mascot. Sudden death earned about $64 million worldwide. That sounds respectable. Until you remember the movie cost around $35 million to make. Once marketing and distribution were added, the theatrical run simply wasn't enough. Home video probably pushed the film into profitability eventually, but the damage had already been done. The planned sequel, which already had a completed script, was canceled. Van Damme decided he could fix things himself. His Universal contract allowed him to direct one movie, so he made The Quest. It was basically another attempt to recreate the magic of Bloodsport. This time, lightning refused to strike twice. Just like Sudden Death, the movie underperformed. Universal responded by ending its relationship with Van Damme. As if that wasn't enough, Jean-Claude also turned down the villain role in Warner Brothers' planned action film Sandstorm, which was supposed to star Wesley Snipes. The movie was eventually canceled anyway, so nobody really won that round. Then everything started falling apart. Watching his career slip away, Van Damme drank more, partied harder, and sank even deeper into drug addiction. Around this same period came one of Hollywood's favorite action star legends, the infamous Scores nightclub incident. Like most legendary Hollywood fights, the story depends entirely on who's telling it. Chuck Zito says he walked into the club, greeted Mickey Rourke and Van Damme, and was immediately met with disrespect from the increasingly intoxicated Belgian. Trying to avoid a fight, Zito walked away. That should have been the end of it. Instead, a club employee later told him that Van Damme had immediately started making fun of him after he'd left. So Zito came back. He demanded an explanation. According to Zito, Van Damme responded with his usual arrogance. That was enough. Zito says he spent the next 30 seconds punching Jean-Claude so hard that chairs, sunglasses, and black belts went flying across the room before security finally dragged him away. Van Damme has always had a much shorter version of the story. According to him, none of it ever happened. Zito insists he injured his own hand punching Van Damme's head and even ended up in the hospital. Mickey Rourke and the club's owners have generally backed up Zito's account. On the other hand, several eyewitnesses remember Van Damme calmly walking out of the club afterward, smiling, signing autographs, and looking perfectly fine. Since nobody sued anyone afterward, the most likely explanation is also the least exciting one. There probably was a fight. It just wasn't the legendary beatdown the tabloids turned it into. Unfortunately, there was no debate about what was happening to Van Damme's movie career. Hollywood was moving on. His movies slowly stopped getting theatrical releases altogether. Legionnaire was originally expected to hit theaters but was quietly pulled from the schedule after the disappointing performance of Knockoff. Then came Inferno. Despite carrying a $26 million budget, it went straight to home video. The final blow came with Universal Soldier: The Return. Its box office failure effectively ended Francois' theatrical career. Movie budgets shrank almost overnight. By the early 2000s, Van Damme had become a permanent resident of the straight-to-video aisle, the place where action stars went when Hollywood stopped returning their calls. A few films like The Order, Derailed, Replicant, In Hell, and Wake of Death still received small theatrical releases in parts of Europe, but they made very little money. One pleasant surprise during that era was JCVD. Critics appreciated seeing Van Damme poke fun at his own image, and the movie even received a respectable theatrical release in France. Unfortunately, audiences still didn't show up. Since 2010, Van Damme has occasionally managed to remind people that he's still around. Sylvester Stallone gave him a huge boost by casting him in The Expendables, but that brief comeback never turned into a full-fledged second act. These days, Van Damme still pops up every now and then in movies with titles you've probably never heard of, and Rotten Tomatoes scores you'd probably rather not see. The good news is that he doesn't make very many of them. He easily could. Looking back, it's hard not to wonder what might have happened if Jean-Claude had gotten his addictions and his ego under control a little earlier. Maybe Hollywood wouldn't have given up on him so quickly. Maybe the studios would have kept giving him chances. Or maybe this was always how the story was going to end. Either way, Van Damme remains one of the defining action stars of an entire generation. A guy who literally kicked his way into Hollywood, reached heights nobody expected, and ultimately discovered that the one opponent he couldn't knock out was himself. That was Frameback. Subscribe for more rewinds and see you on the next one.